Section 19. Cakes and Ale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Cakes and Ale by Edward Spencer. Section 19. Cups and Cordials. Can any mortal mixture breathe such divine, enchanting ravishment? The evil that men do lives after them. I suppose there are almost as many recipes for claret cup as for a cold in the head, and of the many it is probable that the greater proportion will produce a cup which will neither cheer nor inebriate, for the simple reason that nobody, who was not inebriated already, would be physically capable of drinking enough of it. Let us first of all take the late Mr. Donald's recipe for claret cup. A. 1 bottle claret. 1 wineglassful fine pale brandy. 1/2 wineglassful chartreuse yellow. 1/2 wineglassful curaçoa. 1/4 wineglassful maraschino. 2 bottles soda or seltzer. 1 lemon cut in thin slices. A few sprigs of borage, not much. Ice and sugar to taste. Here is a less expensive recipe. B. Put into a bowl the rind of 1 lemon pared very thin. Add some sifted sugar and pour over it a wineglassful of sherry. Then add a bottle of claret, more sugar to taste, a sprig of verbena, 1 bottle of aerated water, and a grated nutmeg. Strain and ice it well. Once more let the fact be emphasized that the better the wine, spirit, etc., the better the cup. Here is a good cup for Ascot, when the sun is shining and you are entertaining the fair sex. C. Put in a large bowl 3 bottles of claret. Saint Estephe is the stamp of wine. A wineglassful large of curaçoa, a pint of dry sherry, half a pint of old brandy, a large wineglassful of raspberry syrup, 3 oranges and 1 lemon cut into slices. Add a few sprigs of borage and a little cucumber rind. 2 bottles of seltzer water and 3 bottles of Stretton water. Mix well and sweeten. Let it stand for an hour and then strain. Put in a large block of ice and a few whole strawberries. Serve in small tumblers. Another way and a simpler. D. Pour into a large jug 1 bottle of claret. Add 2 wineglassfuls of sherry and half a glass of maraschino. Add a few sliced nectarines or peaches and sugar to taste, about a tablespoonful and a half. Let it stand till the sugar is dissolved, then put in a sprig of borage. Just before using add 1 bottle of Stretton water and a large piece of ice. My ideal claret cup. E. 2 bottles Pontet Canet, 2 wineglassfuls old brandy, 1 wineglassful curaçoa, 1 pint bottle sparkling Moselle, 2 bottles aerated water. A sprig or 2 of borage and a little lemon peel. Sugar ad lib. 1 cup will not require much. Add the Moselle and pop water just before using, then put in a large block of ice. Those who have never tried can have no idea of the zest which a small proportion of Moselle lends to a claret cup. My earliest recollection of a cup dates from old cricketing days beneath Henry's holy shade on a match day, as poor old Spanky used to phrase it, a day on which that prince of philosophers and confectioners sold his wares for cash only. Not that he had anything to do with the compounding of the cider cup. Toast a slice of bread and put it at the bottom of a large jug. Grate over the toast nearly half a small nutmeg and a very little ginger. Add a little thin lemon rind and 6 lumps of sugar. Then add 2 wineglasses of sherry and, if for adults, 1 of brandy. If for boys, the brandy and the sherry will suffice. Add also the juice of a small lemon, 2 bottles of lively water, and last of all 3 pints of cider. Mix well, pop in a few sprigs of borage and a block or 2 of ice. Remember once more that the purer the cider, the better will be the cup. There is an infinity of bad cider in the market. There used to be a prejudice against the fermented juice of the apple for all who have gouty tendencies, but as a toe martyr myself, I can bear testimony to the harmlessness of the natural Norfolk cider made at Attleborough, in the which is no touch of podagra. For a good champagne cup, vide Claret cup A, substituting the sparkling for the ruby, the ingredients are precisely the same. A nice harmless beverage, suitable for a tennis party, or to accompany the light refreshments served at a Cinderella dance, or at the breaking up party at a ladies' school, is Chablis cup. Dissolve 4 or 5 lumps of sugar in 1/4 of a pint of boiling water, and put it into a bowl with a very thin slice of lemon rind. Let it stand for half an hour, then add a bottle of Chablis, a sprig of verbena, a wineglassful of sherry, and half a pint of water. Mix well, and let the mixture stand for a while, then strain. Add a bottle of seltzer water, a few strawberries or raspberries, and a block of ice. Serve in small glasses. Balaclava cup. Claret to right of 'em, simpkin to left of 'em, cup worth 100. Get a large bowl to represent the valley, which only the more rabid abstainer would call the valley of death. You will next require a small detachment of thin lemon rind, about 2 tablespoonfuls of sifted sugar, the juice of 2 lemons, and half a cucumber, cut into thin slices with the peel on. Let all these ingredients skirmish about within the bowl. Then bring up your heavy cavalry in the shape of 2 bottles of Chateau something, and one of the best champagne you have got. Last of all, unmask your soda water battery. 2 bottles will be sufficient. Ice and serve in tumblers. Crimean cup. This is a very serious affair. So was the war. The cup, however, leads to more favorable results, and does not, like the campaign, leave a bitter taste in the mouth. Here are the ingredients: 1 quart of syrup of orgeat. To make this vide next recipe. 1 pint and a half of old brandy, half a pint of maraschino, 1 pint of old rum, 2 large and 1 small bottles of champagne, 3 bottles of seltzer water, half a pound of sifted sugar, and the juice of 5 lemons. Peel the lemons and put the thin rind in a mortar with the sugar. Pound them well, and scrape the result with a silver spoon into a large bowl. Squeeze in the juice of the lemons, add the seltzer water, and stir till the sugar is quite dissolved. Then add the orgeat, and whip the mixture well with a whisk so as to whiten it. Add the maraschino, rum, and brandy, and strain the whole into another bowl. Just before the cup is required, put in the champagne, and stir vigorously with a punch ladle. The champagne should be well iced, as no apparent ice is allowable in this mixture. Orgeat. Blanch and pound 3/4 of a pound of sweet almonds and 30 bitter almonds in 1 tablespoonful of water. Stir in by degrees 2 pints of water and 3 pints of milk. Strain the mixture through a cloth. Dissolve half a pound of loaf sugar in 1 pint of water. Boil and skim well, and then mix with the almond water. Add 2 tablespoons of orange flower water and half a pint of old brandy. Be careful to boil the eau sucrée well, as this concoction must not be too watery. Ascot cup. Odds can be laid freely on this, and the host should stay away from the temptations of the betting ring, on purpose to make it. And, parenthetically be it observed, the man who has no soul for cup making should never entertain at a race meeting. The servants will have other things to attend to, and even if they have not, it should be remembered that a cup, or punch, like a salad, should always, if possible, be mixed by some one who is going to partake of the same. Dissolve 6 ounces of sugar in half a pint of boiling water. Add the juice of 3 lemons, 1 pint of old brandy, a wineglass of cherry brandy, a wineglassful of maraschino, half a wineglassful of yellow chartreuse, 2 bottles of champagne. All these should be mixed in a large silver bowl. Add a few sprigs of borage, a few slices of lemon, half a dozen strawberries, half a dozen brandied cherries, and 3 bottles of seltzer water. Put the bowl, having first covered it over, into the refrigerator for 1 hour, and before serving, put a small iceberg into the mixture, which should be served in little tumblers. How many people, I wonder, are aware that champagne and Guinness stout make one of the best combinations possible? You may search the wide, wide world for a cookery book which will give this information, but the mixture is both grateful and strengthening, and is, moreover, far to be preferred to what is known as rich man's shandygaff, which is a mixture of champagne and ale. The old Irishman said that the blackguard should never be placed atop of the gentleman, intending to convey the advice that ale should not be placed on the top of champagne. But the black draught indicated just above is well worth attention. It should be drunk out of a pewter tankard, and is specially recommended as a between the acts refresher for the amateur actor. Ale cup. Squeeze the juice of a lemon into a round of hot toast. Lay on it a thin piece of the rind, a tablespoonful of pounded sugar, a little grated nutmeg, and a sprig of balm. Pour over these 1 glass of brandy, 2 glasses of sherry, and 3 pints of mild ale. Do not allow the balm to remain in the mixture many minutes. One of the daintiest of beverages is a Moselle cup. Ingredients: 1 bottle of Moselle, 1 glass of brandy, 4 or 5 thin slices of pineapple, the peel of half a lemon cut very thin, ice, and sugar ad lib. Just before using, add 1 bottle of sparkling water. Sherry cobbler. Although a popular drink in America, is but little known on this side of the Atlantic. Place in a soda water tumbler 2 wineglassfuls of sherry, 1 tablespoonful of sifted sugar, and 2 or 3 slices of orange. Fill the tumbler with crushed ice and shake well. Drink through straws. Champagne cobbler. Put into a large tumbler 1 tablespoonful of sifted sugar, with a thin paring of lemon and orange peel. Fill the tumbler 1/3 full of crushed ice, and the remainder with champagne. Shake and ornament with a slice of lemon and a strawberry or 2. Drink through straws. Home ruler. This was a favorite drink at the bars of the House of Commons during the reign of the uncrowned king. It was concocted of the yolks of 2 raw eggs, well beaten, a little sugar added, then a tumbler of hot milk taken gradually into the mixture, and last of all a large wineglassful of J.J. whiskey. Cordials. In treating of cordials, it is most advisable that they be home-made. The bulk of the cherry brandy, ginger brandy, etc., which is sold over the counter, is made with inferior brandy, and frequently the operation of blending the virtue of the fruit with the spirit has been hurried. We will commence with the discussion of the favorite cordial of all, cherry brandy. This can either be made from black Gion cherries or morellas, but the latter are better for the purpose. Every pound of cherries will require 1/4 of a pound of white sugar, and 1 pint of the best brandy. The cherries, with the sugar well mixed with them, should be placed in wide-mouthed bottles, filled up with brandy, and if the fruit be previously pricked, the mixture will be ready in a month, but a better blend is procured if the cherries are untouched, and this principle holds good with all fruit treated in this way and left corked for at least 3 months. Sloe gin. For years the sloe, which is the fruit of the blackthorn, was used in England for no other purpose than the manufacture of British port. But at this end of the 19th century the public have been, and are, taking kindly to the cordial, which for a long time had been despised as an old wife's drink. As a matter of fact, it is just as tasty and almost as luscious as cherry brandy. But since sloe gin became fashionable, it has become almost impossible for dwellers within 20 or 30 miles of London to make the cordial at home. For sloes fetch something like 6d. or 7d. a pound in the market, and in consequence the hedgerows are raided by the otherwise unemployed, the fruit being usually picked before the proper time, i.e., when the frost has been on it. The manufacture of sloe gin is as simple as that of cherry brandy. All that is necessary to be done is to allow 1 pound of sugar, white, to 1 pound of sloes. Half fill a bottle, which need not necessarily be a wide-mouthed one, with sugared fruit, and top up with gin. If the sloes have been pricked, the liquor will be ready for use in 2 or 3 months, but do not hurry it. In a year's time the gin will have eaten all the goodness out of the unpricked fruit, and it is in this gradual blending that the secret, as before observed, of making these cordials lies. As a rule, if you call for sloe gin at a licensed house of entertainment, you will get a ruby-colored liquid, tasting principally of gin, and not good gin at that. This is because the making has been hurried. Properly matured sloe gin should be the color of full-bodied port wine. Apricot brandy. This is a cordial which is but seldom met with in this country. To every pound of fruit, which should not be quite ripe, allow 1 pound of loaf sugar. Put the apricots into a preserving pan with sufficient water to cover them. Let them boil up, and then simmer gently until tender. Remove the skins, clarify and boil the sugar, then pour it over the fruit. Let it remain 24 hours. Then put the apricots into wide-mouthed bottles and fill them up with syrup and brandy, half and half. Cork them tightly with the tops of cork sealed. This apricot brandy should be prepared in the month of July and kept 12 months before using. Highland cordial. Here is another rare old recipe. Ingredients: 1 pint of white currants, stripped of their stalks, the thin rind of a lemon, 1 teaspoonful of essence of ginger, and 1 bottle of old Scotch whiskey. Let the mixture stand for 48 hours, and then strain through a hair sieve. Add 1 pound of loaf sugar, which will take at least a day to thoroughly dissolve. Then bottle off and cork well. It will be ready for use in 3 months, but will keep longer. Bitters. 1 ounce of Seville orange peel, half an ounce of gentian root, 1/4 ounce of cardamoms. Husk the cardamoms and crush them with the gentian root. Put them in a wide-mouthed bottle and cover with brandy or whiskey. Let the mixture remain for 12 days, then strain and bottle off for use, after adding 1 ounce of lavender drops. Ginger brandy. Bruise slightly 2 pounds of black currants and mix them with 1 ounce and a half of ground ginger. Pour over them 1 bottle and a half of best brandy, and let the mixture stand for 2 days. Strain off the liquid and add 1 pound of loaf sugar, which has been boiled to a syrup in a little water. Bottle and cork closely. Jumping powder. Comes in very handy on a raw morning after you have ridden a dozen miles or so to a lawn meet. No breakfast, thanks, just a wee nip, that's all. And the ever-ready butler hands round the tray. If you are wise, you will declare on orange brandy, which as a rule is well worth sampling, in a house important enough to entertain hunting men. And orange brandy goes much better than any other liqueur or cordial before noon. It should be made in the month of March. Take the thin rinds of 6 Seville oranges and put them into a stone jar, with half a pint of the strained juice, and 2 quarts of good old brandy. Let it remain 3 days, then add 1 pound and a quarter of loaf sugar, broken, not pounded, and stir till the sugar is dissolved. Let the liqueur stand a day, strain it through paper till quite clear, pour into bottles and cork tightly. The longer it is kept, the better. Mandragora. Can't sleep? What? Not after a dry chapter on liquids? Drink this and you will not require any rocking. Simmer half a pint of old ale, and just as it is about to boil, pour it into a tumbler, grate a little nutmeg over it, and add a teaspoonful of moist sugar, and 2 tablespoonfuls of brandy. Good night, Hamlet. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Cakes and Ale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. Cakes and Ale by Edward Spencer. Section 20. The Daylight Drink. Something too much of this. A nipping and an eager air. Whilst holding the same opinion as the epicure who declared that good eating required good drinking, there is no question but that there should be a limit to both. There is, as Shakespeare told us, a tide in the affairs of man, so why should there not be in this particular affair? Why should it be only ebb tide during the few hours that the man is wrapped in the arms of a bacchanalian Morpheus, either in bed or in custody? The abuse of good liquor is surely as criminal a folly as the abstention therefrom, and the man who mixes his liquors injudiciously lacks that refinement of taste and understanding which is necessary for the appreciation of a good deal of this book, or indeed of any other useful volume. Our grandfathers swore terribly and drank deep, but their fun did not commence until after dinner. And they drank, for the most part, the best of ale, and such port wine as is not to be had in these days of free trade, which is only a euphemism for adulteration, and motor cars. Although mine own teeth are periodically set on edge by the juice of the grape consumed by an ancestor or two, although the gout within me is a heritage from the 3, and 4 bottle era, I respect mine ancestors in that they knew not gin and bitters. The baleful habit of alcoholizing the inner sinner between meal times, the pernicious habit of dram drinking or nipping from early morn till dewy eve, was not introduced into our cities until the latter half of the 19th century had set in. Brandy and soda, at first only used as a livener, and a deadly livener it is, was unknown during the early Victorian era, and the gin crawl, that interminable slouch around the hostelries, is a rank growth of modernity. The nipping habit came to us, with other pernicious notions, from across the Atlantic Ocean. It was brother Jonathan who established the bar system, and although for the most part throughout Great Britain the alcohol is dispensed by young ladies with fine eyes and a great deal of adventitious hair, and the bar-keep with his big watch-chain and his guns placed within easy reach for quick-shooting saloon practice is unknown on this side, the herd of the system, to employ an Americanism, gets there just the same. There is not the same amount of carousing in the British army as in the days when I was a gilded popinjay, in the language of Mr. John Burns. A 5 and 2 assassin, in the words of somebody else. In those days the use of alcohol, if not absolutely encouraged for the use of the subaltern, was winked at by his superiors, as long as the subalterns were not on duty, or on the line of march, and I don't know so much about the line of march either. But with any orderly or responsible duty to be done, the beverage of heroes was not admired. "Now mind," once observed our revered colonel, in the ante-room after dinner, "none of you young officers get seeing snakes and things, or otherwise rendering yourselves unfit for service, or I'll try the lot of you by court-martial. I will, by—" Here the adjutant let the regimental Bible drop with a bang. Tea is the favourite ante-room refreshment nowadays, when the officer, young or old, is always either on duty or at school. And the education of the modern warrior is never completed. But the civilian, sing ho, the wicked civilian, is a reveller, and a wine-bibber for the most part. Very little business is transacted, except over what is called a friendly glass. "I want 745 from you, old chappie," says Reggie de Beers of the house, on settling day. "Right," replies his friend, young Berthas. "Toss you double or quits. Down with it." And it would be a cold day were not a magnum or two of "the boy" to be opened over the transaction. The cheap eating-house keeper who has spent his morning at the market, cheapening a couple of pigs or a dozen scraggy fowls, will have spent double the money he has saved in the bargain in rum and sixpenny ale ere he gets home again. And even a wholesale deal in evening journals, between two youths in the street, requires to be wetted. Very sad, is it not? But as anything which I, who am popularly supposed to be something resembling a roisterer, but who am in reality one of the most discreet of those who enjoy life, can write, is not likely to work a change in the system which obtains amongst English-speaking nations, perhaps the sooner I get on with the programme the better. Later on I may revert to the subject. Amongst daylight, and midnight for the matter of that, drinks, the cocktail, that fascinating importation from Dollar Land, holds a prominent place. This is a concoction for which, with American bars all over the metropolis, the Cockney does not really require any recipe, but as I trust to have some country readers, a few directions may be appended. Brandy Cocktail. 1 wineglassful of old brandy, 6 drops of Angostura bitters, and 20 drops of curaçao, in a small tumbler. All cocktails should be made in a small silver tumbler. Shake and pour into glass tumbler, then fill up with crushed ice. Put a shred of lemon peel atop. Champagne Cocktail. 1 teaspoonful of sifted sugar, 10 drops of Angostura bitters, a small slice of pineapple, and a shred of lemon peel. Strain into glass tumbler, add crushed ice, and as much champagne as the tumbler will hold. Mix with a spoon. Bengal Cocktail. Fill tumbler half full of crushed ice. Add 30 drops of maraschino, 1 tablespoonful of pineapple syrup, 30 drops of curaçao, 6 drops of Angostura bitters, 1 wineglassful of old brandy. Stir and put a shred of lemon peel atop. Milford Cocktail. Dedicated to Mr. Jersey. Put into a half-pint tumbler a couple of lumps of best ice, 1 teaspoonful of sifted sugar, 1 teaspoonful of orange bitters, half a wineglassful of brandy. Top up with bottled cider and mix with a spoon. Serve with a strawberry and a sprig of verbena atop. Manhattan Cocktail. Half a wineglassful of vermouth, Italian, half a wineglassful of rye whiskey, according to the American recipe, though personally I prefer Scotch, 10 drops of Angostura bitters, and 6 drops of curaçao. Add ice, shake well, and strain. Put a shred of lemon peel atop. Yum Yum Cocktail. Break the yolk of a new laid egg into a small tumbler, and put a teaspoonful of sugar on it, then 6 drops of Angostura bitters, a wineglassful of sherry, and half a wineglassful of brandy. Shake all well together and strain. Dust a very little cinnamon over the top. Gin Cocktail. 10 drops of Angostura bitters, 1 wineglassful of gin, 10 drops of curaçao, 1 shred of lemon peel. Fill up with ice, shake, and strain. Newport Cocktail. Put 2 lumps of ice and a small slice of lemon into the tumbler, add 6 drops of Angostura bitters, half a wineglassful of noyau, and a wineglassful of brandy. Stir well and serve with peel atop. Saratoga Cocktail. This is a more important affair and requires a large tumbler for the initial stage. 1 teaspoonful of pineapple syrup, 10 drops of Angostura bitters, 1 teaspoonful of maraschino, and a wineglassful of old brandy. Nearly fill the tumbler with crushed ice and shake well. Then place a couple of strawberries in a small tumbler, strain the liquid on them, put in a strip of lemon peel, and top up with champagne. Whiskey Cocktail. Put into a small tumbler 10 drops of Angostura bitters and 1 wineglassful of Scotch whisky. Fill the tumbler with crushed ice, shake well, strain into a large wineglass, and place a strip of peel atop. But the ordinary British bar cuddler, as he is called in the slang of the day, reeks not of cocktails, nor indeed of Columbian combinations of any sort. He has his own particular vanity, and frequently a pet name for it. Gin and Angry Story, Angostura, Slow and Old, Slow Gin and Old Tom, Pony Burton, please miss, are a few of the demands the attentive listener may hear given. Orange gin, gin and orange gin, gin and sherry, oh bile, where is thy sting, are favourite midday refreshers, and I have heard a well-known barrister call for a split Worcester, a small wineglass full of Worcester sauce with a split soda, without a smile on his expressive countenance. Small lamb and a dash is a favourite summer beverage, and, withal, a harmless one, consisting of a small bottle of lemonade, with about an eighth of a pint of bitter ale added thereto. In one old-fashioned hostelry I wot of, the same in which the chair of the late Dr. Samuel Johnson is on view, customers who require to be stimulated with gin call for "rack," and Irish whiskey is known by none other name than "cork." The habitual bar-cuddler usually rubs his hands violently together as he requests a little attention from the presiding Hebe, and affects a sort of shocked surprise at the presence on the scene of any one of his friends or acquaintances. He is well up, too, in the slang phraseology of the day, which he will ride to death on every available opportunity. Full well do I remember him in the "How's your poor feet" era, and it seems but yesterday that he was informing the company in assertive tones, "Now we shan't be long." The free lunch idea of the Yankees is only thoroughly carried out in the North Country, where, at the best hotels, there is often a great bowl of soup, or a dish of jugged hare, or of Irish stew, pro bono publico, and by publico is implied the hotel directorate as well as the customers. In London, however, the free lunch seldom soars above salted almonds, coffee beans, cloves, with biscuits and American cheese. But at most refreshment houses is to be obtained for cash some sort of a restorative sandwich, or bonne bouche, in the which anchovies and hard-boiled eggs play leading parts, and amongst other restorative food I have noticed that parallelograms of cold Welsh rarebit are exceedingly popular amongst wine travellers and advertisement agents. The genius who propounded the statement that "there is nothing like leather" could surely never have sampled a cold Welsh rarebit. Bosom caresser. Put into a small tumbler 1 wineglassful of sherry, half a wineglassful of old brandy, the yolk of an egg, 2 teaspoonfuls of sugar, and 2 grains of cayenne pepper. Add crushed ice, shake well, strain, and dust over with nutmeg and cinnamon. A nicobine, or knickerbine, as I have seen it spelt, used to be a favorite short drink in Malta, and consisted of the yolk of an egg, intact, in a wineglass with layers of curaçao, maraschino, and green chartreuse, the liquors not allowed to mix with one another. The knickerbein recipe differs materially from this, as brandy is substituted for chartreuse, and the ingredients are shaken up and strained, the white of the egg being whisked and placed atop. But either way you will get a good bile-provoking mixture. In the West Indies, if you thirst for rum and milk, cocoa-nut milk is the only ware, and a very delicious potion it is. A favourite mixture in Jamaica was the juice of a star-apple, the juice of an orange, a wineglassful of sherry, and the dust of nutmeg. I never heard a name given to this. Bull's milk. This is a comforting drink for summer or winter. During the latter season, instead of adding ice, the mixture may be heated. 1 teaspoonful of sugar in a large tumbler, half a pint of milk, half a wineglassful of rum, a wineglassful of brandy, add ice, shake well, strain and powder with cinnamon and nutmeg. Fairy kiss. Put into a small tumbler the juice of a quarter of lemon, a quarter of a wineglassful each of the following: vanilla syrup, curaçao, yellow chartreuse, brandy. Add ice, shake, and strain. Flash of lightning. 1/3 of a wineglassful each of the following in a small tumbler: raspberry syrup, curaçao, brandy, and 3 drops of Angostura bitters. Add ice, shake, and strain. Flip-flap. 1 wineglassful of milk in a small tumbler, 1 well-beaten egg, a little sugar, and a wineglassful of port. Ice, shake, strain, and sprinkle with cinnamon and nutmeg. Maiden's blush. Half a wineglassful of sherry in a small tumbler, a quarter of a wineglassful of strawberry syrup, and a little lemon juice. Add ice and a little raspberry syrup. Shake, and drink through straws. Athol brose is compounded, according to a favourite author, in the following manner: upon virgin honeycombs you pour, according to their amount, the oldest French brandy and the most indisputable Scotch whisky in equal proportions. You allow this goodly mixture to stand for days in a large pipkin in a cool place, and it is then strained and ready for drinking. Epicures drop into the jug, by way of imparting artistic finish, a small fragment of the honeycomb itself. This I deprecate. Tiger's milk. Small tumbler. Half a wineglassful each of cider and Irish whiskey, a wineglassful of peach brandy. Beat up separately the white of an egg with a little sugar, and add this. Fill up the tumbler with ice, shake and strain. Add half a tumbler of milk, and grate a little nutmeg atop. Wyndham. Large tumbler, equal quantities, a liquor glass of each, of maraschino, curaçao, brandy, with a little orange peel and sugar. Add a glass of champagne and a small bottle of seltzer water. Ice, and mix well together. Stir with a spoon. Happy Eliza. Put into a skillet 12 fresh dried figs cut open, 4 apples cut into slices without peeling, and half a pound of loaf sugar, broken small. Add 2 quarts of water, boil for 20 minutes, strain through a... Where's the brandy? Stop! I've turned over 2 leaves and got amongst the temperance strings. Rein back. Mint julep. This properly made is the most delicious of all American beverages. It is mixed in a large tumbler, in the which are placed, first of all, 2½ tablespoonfuls of water, 1 tablespoonful of sugar, crushed, and 2 or 3 sprigs of mint, which should be pressed with a spoon or crusher into the sugar and water to extract the flavor. Add 2 wineglassfuls of old brandy. Now we shan't be long. Fill up with powdered ice, shake well, get the mint to the top of the tumbler, stalks down, and put a few strawberries and slices of orange atop. Shake in a little rum, last of all, and drink through straws. Possets, an 18th century recipe. Take 3 gills of sweet cream, a grated rind of lemon, and juice thereof, 3/4 of a pint of sack or Rhenish wine, sweeten to your taste with loaf sugar, then beat in a bowl with a whisk for 1 hour, and fill your glasses and drink to the king. We are tolerably loyal in this our time, still it is problematical if there exist man or woman in merry England, in our day, who would whisk a mixture for 60 minutes by the clock, even with the prospect of drinking to the reigning monarch. Brandy sour. This is simplicity itself. A teaspoonful of sifted sugar in a small tumbler, a little lemon rind and juice, 1 wineglassful of brandy. Fill nearly up with crushed ice, shake and strain. Whisky sour is merely Scotch whisky treated in the same kind, open-handed manner, with the addition of a few drops of raspberry syrup. Blue blazer. Don't be frightened, there is absolutely no danger. Put into a silver mug or jug, previously heated, 2 wineglassfuls of overproof or proof Scotch whisky, and 1 wineglassful of boiling water. Set the liquor on fire, and pass the blazing liquor into another mug, also well heated. Pass to and fro, and serve in a tumbler with a lump of sugar and a little thin lemon peel. Be very particular not to drop any of the blazer on the cat, or the hearthrug, or the youngest child. This drink would, I should think, have satisfied the aspirations of Mr. Daniel Quilp. One of the most wholesome of all refreshers is a simple liquor, distilled from black currants, and known to our lively neighbours as cassis. This syrup can be obtained in the humblest cabaret in France, but we have to thank the eccentric and illogical ways of our customs department for its absence from most of our own wine lists. The duty is so prohibitive, being half as much again as that levied on French brandy, that it would pay nobody but said customs department to import it into England, and yet the amount of alcohol contained in cassis is infinitesimal. Strange to say, nobody has ever started a cassis still on this side. One would imagine that the process would be simplicity itself, as the liquor is nothing but cold black currant tea with a suspicion of alcohol in it. Sligo Slop. This is an Irish delight. The juice of 10 lemons, strained, 10 tablespoonfuls of sifted sugar, 1 quart of John Jameson's oldest and best whisky, and 2 port wine glassfuls of curaçao, all mixed together. Let the mixture stand for a day or two, and then bottle. This should be drunk neat in liqueur glasses, and is said to be the most effectual jumping powder. It certainly reads conducive to timber topping. Take it all together, the daylight drink is a mistake. It is simply ruin to appetite. It is more expensive than those who indulge therein are aware of at the time. It ruins the nerves sooner or later. It is not conducive to business, unless for those whose heads are especially hard, and it spoils the palate for the good wine which is poured forth later on. The precept cannot be too widely laid down, too fully known. Do not drink between meals. Better, far better, the 3-bottle trick of our ancestors than the gin crawl of today. End of section 20.
Section 21 of Cakes and Ale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie Rue. Cakes and Ale by Edward Spencer. Section 20. Gastronomy in Fiction and Drama. Chapter 21. Gastronomy in Fiction and Drama. Let me not burst in ignorance. Achilles among ye, taking notes. Thomas Carlyle, Thackeray, Harrison Ainsworth, Sir Walter Scott, Miss Braddon, Marie Corelli, F.C. Phillips, Blackmore, Charles Dickens, Pickwick, reeking with alcohol, brandy and oysters, Little Dorrit, Great Expectations, Macabre as a punch-maker, David Copperfield, Practicable Food in the Stage, Johnny Toole's story of Tiny Tim and the Goose. Considering the number of books which have been published during the 19th century, it is astonishing how few of them deal with eating and drinking. We read of a banquet or two, certainly, in the works of the divine William, but no particulars as to the cuisine are entered into. Cold banquo hardly sounds appetizing. Thomas Carlyle was a notorious dyspeptic, so it is no cause for wonderment that he did not bequeath into posterity the recipes for a dainty dish or two, or a good Derby Day cup. Thackeray understood but little about cookery, nor was White Melville much better versed in the mysteries of the kitchen. Harrison Ainsworth touched lightly on gastronomy occasionally, whilst Charles Lamb, Sidney Smith, and others, blessings light upon the man who invented the phrase, and others, delighted therein. Miss Braddon has slurred it over hitherto, and Marie Corelli scorns all mention of any refreshment but absinthe, a weird liquor which is altogether absent from these pages. In lighter novels, Mr. F.C. Phillips, there is but little mention of solid food, except deviled caviar, which sounds nasty. But most of Mr. Phillips' men and all his women drink to excess, principally champagne, brandy, and green chartreuse. And one of his heroines is a firm believer in the merits of cognac as a settler of champagne. According to Mr. R.D. Blackmore, the natives of Exmoor did themselves particularly well in the 17th century, and that most delightful romance, Lorna Doone, is a description of a meal set before Tom Faggus, the celebrated highwayman, by the Ridd family at Plover's Barrows. A few oysters first, and then dried salmon, and then ham and eggs, done in small curled rashers, and then a few collops of venison toasted, and next a little cold roast pig, and a woodcock on toast to finish with. This meal was washed down with home-brewed ale, followed by Schiedam and hot water. One man, and one man alone, who has left his name printed deep on the sands of time, has a writer, thoroughly revelled in the mighty subjects of eating and drinking. Need his name be mentioned? What is, after all, the great secret of the popularity of Charles Dickens as a novelist? His broad, generous views on the subject of meals, as expressed through the mouths of most of the characters in his works, as also the homely nature of such meals, and the good and great deeds to which they led. I once laid myself out to count the number of times that alcoholic refreshment is mentioned in some of the principal works of the great author, and the record for Pickwick alone was sufficient to sweep from the surface of the earth with its fiery breath the entire blue ribbon army. Mr. Pickwick was what would be called nowadays a moderate drinker. That is to say, he seldom neglected an excuse for a lotion, nor did he despise the daylight drink. But we only read of his being overcome by his potations on 2 occasions, after the cricket dinner at Muggleton, and after the shooting luncheon on Captain Boldwick's ground. And upon the latter I am convinced that the hot sun had far more to do with his temporary obfuscation than the cold punch. Bob Sawyer and Ben Allen were by no means exaggerated types of the medical students of the time. The deputy sawbones of today writes pamphlets, drinks coffee, and pays his landlady every Saturday. And it was a happy touch of Dickens to make Sawyer and Allen eat oysters and wash them down with neat brandy before breakfast. I have known medical students, and full-blown surgeons too, who would commit equally daring acts, although I doubt much if they would have shown at the breakfast table afterwards, or on the ice later in the day. For the effect exercised by brandy on oysters is pretty well known to science. Breathes there a man with soul so dead as not to appreciate the delights of Dingley Dell? Free trade and other horrors have combined to crush the British yeoman of today, but we none the less delight to read of him as he was, and I do not know a better cure for an attack of the Blue Devils, or should it be Black Dog, than a good dose of Dingley Dell. The wholesale manner in which Mr. Wardle takes possession of the Pickwickians, only one of whom he knows intimately, for the purposes of entertainment, is especially delightful and worthy of imitation, and I can only regret the absence of a good, cunningly mixed cup at the picnic after the Chatham Review. The wine drunk at this picnic would seem to have been sherry, as there was not such a glut of sparkling in those good old times, and the prompt way in which Emma is commanded to bring out the cherry brandy before his guests have been 2 minutes in the house bespeaks the character of dear old Wardle at once. The Leathern Bottle, a charming old-world hostelry in that picaresque country lying between Rochester and Cobham, would hardly have been in existence now, let alone doing a roaring trade, but for the publication of Pickwick. And the notion of the obese Tupman solacing himself for blighted hopes and taking his leave of the world on a diet of roast fowl bacon, ale, etc., is unique. The bill of fare at the aforementioned shooting luncheon might not, perhaps, satisfy the aspirations of Sir Mota Kerr or some other nouveau riche of the day, but there was plenty to eat and drink. Here is a list in Mr. Samuel Weller's own words. Weal pie tongue, a very good thing when it ain't a woman's, bread, knuckle o' ham, regular picter, cold beef in slices, very good. What's in them stone jars, young Touch-and-go? Beer in this one, replied the boy, taking it from his shoulder, a couple of large stone bottles, fastened together by a leathern strap, cold punch and other. A very good notion of a lunch it is, taken altogether, said Mr. Weller. Possibly, though cold beef in slices would be apt to get rather drier than was desirable on a warm day, and milk punch hardly seems the sort of tipple to encourage accuracy of aim. Mrs. Bardell's notion of a nice little supper, we gather from the same immortal work, was a couple of sets of potatoes. The potatoes were presumably simmered in milk, and the cheese was undoubtedly browning away most delightfully in a little Dutch oven in front of the fire. Most of us will smack our lips after this description, though details are lacking as to the contents of the black bottle, which was produced from a small closet. But among students of Pickwick, Old Tom is a favourite. The deputy shepherd's particular vanity appears to have been buttered toast and reeking hot pineapple rum and water, which sounds like swimming in the head and going straight through the book. We next pause at the description of a supper given by the medical students at their lodgings in the Borough to the Pickwickians. The man to whom the order for oysters had been sent had not been told to open them. It is a very difficult thing to open an oyster with a limp knife or a 2-pronged fork, and very little was done in this way. Very little of the beef was done either, and the ham, which was from the German sausage shop round the corner, was in a similar predicament. However, there was plenty of porter in the tin can, and the cheese went a great way, for it was very strong. Probably the oysters had not been paid for in advance, and the man imagined that they would be returned upon his hands none the worse. For at that time, as has been remarked before on this volume of gastronomy, the knowledge that an oyster baked in its own shells and the middle of a clear fire is an appetizing dish does not appear to have been universal. It is questionable if a supper consisting of boiled leg of mutton with the usual trimmings would have satisfied the taste of a gentleman's gentleman of today, who is a hypercritic if anything, but let that supper be taken as read. Also, let it be noted that the appetite of the redoubtable Pickwick never seems to have failed him. Even in the sponging house, 5 to 1 can be betted that those chops were fried, or in the Fleet prison itself. And the mention of this establishment recalls the extravagant folly of Job Trotter, who of all men ought to have known better, in purchasing a small piece of raw loin of mutton for the refection of himself and ruined master, when for the same money he could have surely obtained sufficiency of bullock's cheek or liver, potatoes and onion, to provide dinner for 3 days, vied the Kent Road crockery in one of the earlier chapters. The description of the journeys from Bristol to Birmingham and back to London absolutely reeks with food and alcohol, and it has always smacked of the mysterious to myself how Sam Weller, a pure Cockney, could have known so much about the capacities of the various hostelries on the road. Evidently his knowledge of other places besides London was peculiar. The last scene of all in Pickwick required mentioning here is the refection given to Mr. Solomon Pell in honour of the proving of the late Dame Weller's last will and testament. Porter, cold beef, and oysters were some of the incidents of that meal, and we read that the coachman with the hoarse voice took an imperial pint of vinegar with his oysters, without betraying the least emotion. It is also set down that brandy and water, as usual in this history, followed the oysters, but we are not told if any of those coachmen ever handled the ribbons again, or if Mr. Solomon Pell spent his declining days in the infirmary. In fact, there are not many chapters in Charles Dickens' work in which the knife and fork do not play prominent parts. The food is, for the most part, simple and homely, the seed sown in England by the fairy Allah, and hardly begun to germinate at the time when the novels were written. Still, there is naturally a suspicion of Allah at the very commencement of Little Dorrit, the scene being laid in the Marseillaise prison, where Monsieur Rigaud feasts off Lyons sausage, veal in savoury jelly, white bread, stracchino cheese, and good claret, while his humble companion, Signor Jean Baptiste, has to content himself with stale bread, through reverses at gambling with his fellow prisoner. After that there is no mention of a square meal until we get to Mr. Casby's, the patriarch. Everything about the patriarchal household, we are told, promoted quiet digestion, and the dinner mentioned began with some soup, some fried soles, a butter boat of shrimp sauce, and dish of potatoes. Rare old Casby. Mutton, a steak, and apple pie, and presumably cheese, furnished the more solid portion of the banquet, which appears to have been washed down with porter and sherry wine, and enlivened by inconsequent remarks of Mr. F.'s aunt. In great expectation occurs the celebrated banquet at the Chateau Gargany on Christmas Day, consisting of a leg of pickled pork and greens, a pair of roast stuffed fowls, a handsome mince pie, and plum pudding. The absence of the savoury pork pie and the presence of tar water in the brandy are incidents at that banquet familiar enough to Sir Frank Lockwood, Q.C., M.P., and other close students of Dickens, whose favourite dinner dish would appear to have been a fowl, stuffed or otherwise, roasted or boiled. In Oliver Twist we get a casual mention of oysters, sheep's head, and a rabbit pie, with plenty of alcohol. But the bill of fare on the whole is not an appetizing one. The meat and drink at the Maypole Hotel in Barnaby Rudge would appear to have been deservedly popular, and the description of Gabriel Varden's breakfast is calculated to bring water to the most callous mouth. Over and above the ordinary tea equipage, the board creaked beneath the weight of a jolly round of beef, a ham of the first magnitude, and sundry towers of buttered Yorkshire cake, piled slice upon slice in the most alluring manner. There was also a goodly jug of well-browned clay, fashioned into the form of an old gentleman, not by any means unlike the locksmith, atop of whose bald head was a fine white froth answering to his wig, indicative beyond dispute of sparkling home-brewed ale. but better than fair home-brewed ale, or Yorkshire cake, or ham, or beef, or anything to eat or drink that earth or air or water can supply, there sat, presiding over all, the locksmith's rosy daughter, before whose dark eyes even beef grew insignificant, and the malt became as nothing. Ah! There's not much eating in A Tale of Two Cities, but an intolerable amount of assorted sack. In Sketches by Boz, we learn that Dickens had no great opinion of public dinners, and that oysters were, at that period, occasionally opened by the fair sex. There is a nice flavour of fowl and old Madeira about Dombey and Son, and the description of the dinner at Dr. Blimber's establishment for young gentlemen is worth requoting. There was some nice soup, also roast meat, boiled meat, vegetables, pie, and cheese. Cheese at a small boys' school. Every young gentleman had a massive silver fork and a napkin, and all the arrangements were stately and handsome. In particular, there was a butler in a blue coat and bright buttons. Surely this was a footman, who gave quite a winy flavour to the table beer. He poured it out so superbly. Dinner at Mrs. Jellyby's in Bleak House is one of the funniest and most delightful incidents in the book, especially the attendants. The young woman with the flannel bandage waited, and dropped everything on the table wherever it happened to go, and never moved it again till she put it on the stairs. The person I had seen in Pattens, who I supposed to have been the cook, frequently came in and skirmished with her at the door, and there appeared to be ill will between them. The dinner given by Mr. Guppy at the Slap-Bang Dining House is another feature of this book. Veal and ham, and French beans, summer cabbage, pots of half and half, marrow puddings, 3 Cheshires, and 3 small rums. Of the items in this list, the marrow pudding seems to be as extinct in London, at all events, as the dodo. It appears to be a mixture of bread, pounded almonds, cream, eggs, lemon peel, sugar, nutmeg, and marrow, and sounds nice. David Copperfield's dinner in his Buckingham Street chambers was an event with a disastrous termination. It was a remarkable want of forethought on the part of the ironmonger who had made Mrs. Crupp's kitchen fireplace, that it was capable of cooking nothing but chops and mashed potatoes. As to a fish kettle, Mrs. Crupp said, "Well, would I only come and look at the range?" She couldn't say fairer than that. Would I come and look at it? As I should not have been much wiser if I had looked at it. I said, never mind the fish. But Mrs. Crupp said, "Don't say that. Oysters was in, and why not them?" So that was settled. Mrs. Crupp then said, what she would recommend would be this: a pair of hot roast fowls from the pastry cook's, a dish of stewed beef with vegetables from the pastry cook's, 2 little corner things as a raised pie and a dish of kidneys from the pastry cook's, a tart, and, if I like, a shape of jelly from the pastry cook's. This, Mrs. Crupp said, would leave her at full liberty to concentrate her mind on the potatoes, and to serve up the cheese and celery as she could wish to see it done. Then blessings on thee, Micawber, the most charming of characters in fiction, mightiest of punch brewers. The only fault I have to find with the novel of David Copperfield is that we don't get enough of Micawber. The same fault, however, could hardly be said to lie in the play, for if ever there was a fat part, it is Wilkins Micawber. Martin Chuzzlewit bubbles over with eating and drinking, and Todgers has become proverbial as Hamlet. In Nicholas Nickleby, too, we find mention of solids and liquids, and as a poor stroller myself at one time, it has always struck me that business could not have been so very bad after all, in the Crumleys combination, for the manager, at all events, seemed to have fared particularly well. Last on the list comes the old curiosity shop, with the celebrated stew at the Jolly Sandboys, the ingredients in which have already been quoted by the present writer. With regard to this stew, all I have to remark is that I should have substituted an ox kidney for the tripe, and left out the sparrowgrass, the flavour of which would be quite lost in the crowd of ingredients. But there, who can cavil at such a feast? Fetch me a pint of warm ale, and don't let nobody bring into the room even so much as a biscuit till the time arrives. Codlin may not have been the friend, but he was certainly the judge of the punch party. In this realistic age, meals on the stage have to be provided from high-class hotels or restaurants, and this is probably the chief reason why there is so little eating and drinking introduced into the modern drama. Gone are the nights of the banquet pasteboard poultry, property pineapples, and gilded flagons containing nothing more sustaining than the atmosphere of coal gas. Not much faith is placed in the comic scenes of a pantomime nowadays, or it is probable that the clown would purloin real York hams and stuff Wall's sausages into the pockets of his ample pants. Champagne is champagne under the present regime of raised prices, raised salaries, raised everything, and it is not so long ago since I overheard an actor-manager chide a waiter from a fashionable restaurant for forgetting the soubise sauce when he brought the cutlets. In my acting days, we usually had canvas fowls stuffed with sawdust when we revelled on the stage, or if business had been particularly good, the poultry was made from breakfast rolls, with pieces skewered on to represent the limbs. And potables? Gadzooks, what horrible concoctions have found their way down this unsuspecting throttle? Sherry was invariably represented by cold tea, which is palatable enough if homemade, under careful superintendence, but drawn in the property master's den, usually tasted of glue. Ginger beer, at 3 farthings for 2 bottles, poured into tumblers containing portions of a Sedz-like powder, always did duty for champagne, and as for port or claret, well, I quite thought I had swallowed the deadliest of poisons one night, until assured it was only the cold leavings of the stage-door keeper's coffee. The story of Tiny Tim who ate the goose is a pretty familiar one in stage circles. When playing Bob Cratchit in the Christmas Carol at the Adelphi, under Benjamin Webster's management, Mr. J. L. Toole had to carve a real goose and a practicable plum pudding during the run of that piece, 40 nights, and the little girl who played Tiny Tim used to finish her portions of goose and pudding with such amazing celerity that Mr. Toole became quite alarmed on her account. "I don't like it," I said, writes dear friend Johnny in his reminiscences. "I can't conceive where a poor delicate little thing like that puts the food. Besides, although I like the children to enjoy a treat, and how they kept on enjoying it for 40 nights is a mystery, for I got into such a condition that if I dined at a friend's house and goose was on the table, I regarded it as a personal affront," I said, referring to Tiny Tim. "I don't like greediness, and it is additionally repulsive in a refined-looking, delicate little thing like this. Besides, it destroys the sentiment of the situation. And when I, as Bob, ought to feel most pathetic, I am always wondering where the goose and the pudding are, or whether anything serious in the way of fit will happen to Tiny Tim before the audience, in consequence of her unnatural gorging." Mrs. Mellon laughed at me at first, but eventually we decided to watch Tiny Tim together. We watched as well we could, and the moment Tiny Tim was seated and began to eat, we observed a curious shuffling movement at the stage fireplace, and everything that I had given her, goose and potato and apple sauce, disappeared behind the sham stove, and the child pretending to eat as heartily as ever from the empty plate. When the performance was over, Mrs. Mellon and myself asked the little girl what became of the food she did not eat, and after a little hesitation, she confessed that her little sister, I should mention that they were the children of one of the scene shifters, waited on the other side of the fireplace for the supplies, and then the whole family enjoyed a hearty supper every night. Dickens was very much interested in the incident. When I had finished, he smiled a little sadly, I thought, and then shaking me by the hand said, "Ah, you should have given her the whole goose." End of section 21.
Section 22 of Cakes and Ale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Cakes and Ale by Edward Spencer. Section 22. Restoratives. Raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some antibilious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the soul. "I care not," observed William of Normandy to his quartermaster general on the morning after the revelry which followed the battle of Hastings, "who makes these barbarians' wines. Send me the man who can remove the beehive from my o'erwrought brain." This remark is not to be found in Macaulay's History of England, but learned authorities who have read the original manuscript in early Norman make no doubt as to the correct translation. It is excellent, as the poet says, to have a giant's thirst, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant, and not only tyrannous but short-sighted. For the law of compensation is one of the first edicts of nature. The same beneficent hand which provides the simple fruits of the earth for the delectation of man furnishes also the slug and the wasp to see that he doesn't get too much. Our friend the dog is deprived of the power of articulation, but he has a tail which can be wagged at the speed of 600 revolutions to the minute, and the man who overtaxes the powers of his inner mechanism during the hours of darkness is certain to feel the effects, to be smitten of conscience and troubles of brain when he awakes a few hours later on. As this is not a medical treatise, it would be out of place to analyze at length the abominable habit which the human brain and stomach have acquired of acting and reacting on each other. Suffice it to say that there is no surer sign of the weakness and helplessness of poor, frail, sinful, fallen humanity than the obstinacy with which so many of us will, for the sake of an hour or two's revelry, boldly bid for 5 times the amount of misery and remorse. And this more especially applies to a life on the ocean wave. The midshipmite who overestimates his swallowing capacity is no longer mast-headed next morning, but the writer has experienced a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal ere the effects of a birthday party on the previous night had been surmounted, and the effects of mast-heading could hardly have been less desirable. In that most delightful work for the young, Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, we read, "Our forecastle, as usual after a Liberty Day, was a scene of tumult all night long, from the drunken ones. They had just got to sleep toward morning, when they were turned up with the rest and kept at work all day in the water, carrying hides, their heads aching so that they could hardly stand. This is sailor's pleasure." Dana himself was ordered up aloft to reef topsails on his first morning at sea, and he had probably had some sort of a farewell carouse ere quitting Boston. And the present writer upon one occasion, such is the irony of fate, was told off to indite a leading article on temperance for an evening journal within a very few hours of the termination of a Derby banquet. But how shall we alleviate the pangs? How make that dreadful day after endurable enough to cause us to offer up thanks for being still allowed to live? Come the panacea, good doctor. First of all, then, avoid the chemist and his works. I mean no disrespect to my good friend Sainsbury or his #1 pick-me-up, whose corpse-reviving claims are indisputable. But at the same time the habitual swallower of drugs does not lead the happiest life. I once knew a young subaltern who had an account presented to him by the cashier of the firm Peake and Allen of the great continent of India, for nearly 300 rupees, and the items in said account were entirely choleric ether, extract of cardamoms, with the other component parts of a high-class restorative and interest. Saddening. The next thing to avoid, the first thing in the morning, is soda water, whether diluted with brandy or whiskey. The peg may be all very well as an occasional potation, but believe one who has tried most compounds, 'tis a precious poor livener. On the contrary, although a beaker of the straw-colored, or occasionally mahogany-colored fluid may seem to steady the nerves for the time being, that effect is by no means lasting. But the same panacea will not do in every case. If the patient be sufficiently convalescent to digest a doctor, I do not mean an MRCS, his state must be far from hopeless. A doctor is a mixture of beaten raw egg, not forgetting the white, which is of even more value than the yolk to the invalid, brandy, a little sifted sugar, and new milk. But many devotees of Bacchus could as soon swallow rum and oysters in bed. And do not let us blame Bacchus unduly for the matutinal trouble. The fairy Allah has probably had a lot to do with that trouble. A doctor can be made with sherry or whiskey instead of brandy, and many stockbrokers' clerks, sporting journalists, and other millionaires prefer a surgeon major, who appears in the form of a large tumbler containing a couple of eggs beaten and filled to the brim with the wine of the Champagne district. A scorcher is made with the juice of half a lemon squeezed into a large wine glass, add a liquor glassful of old brandy or Hollands, and a dust of cayenne. Mix well, and do not allow any lemon pips to remain in the glass. Prairie oyster, This is an American importation. There is a legend to the effect that one of a hunting party fell sick unto death on the boundless prairie of Texas and clamored for oysters. Now the close and cautious bivalve no more thrives in a bluegrass country than he possesses the ability to walk upstairs or make a starting price book. So one of the party, an inventive genius, cudgeled his brains for a substitute. He found some prairie hen's eggs and administered the unbroken yolks thereof one at a time in a wine glass containing a teaspoonful of vinegar. He shook the pepper castor over the yolks and added a pinch of salt. The patient recovered. The march of science has improved on this recipe. Instead of despoiling the prairie hen, the epicure now looks to Madame Gobble for a turkey egg, and a Worcester oyster is turned out ready-made by simply substituting a teaspoonful of Lee and Perrin's most excellent sauce for vinegar. Brazil relish. This is, I am assured, a much admired restorative in Brazil, and the regions bordering on the River Plate. It does not sound exactly the sort of stimulant to take after a bump supper or a Kaffir entertainment, but here it is. Into a wine glass half full of curaçao pop the unbroken yolk of a bantam's egg. Fill the glass up with maraschino. According to my notion, a good cup of hot strong tea would be equally effectual as an emetic, and withal cheaper. But certainly they take the mixture as a pick-me-up in Brazil. Port flip is a favorite stimulant with our American cousins. Beat up an egg in a tumbler. If you have no metal vessels to shake it in, the shortest way is to put a clean white card or a saucer over the mouth of the tumbler and shake. Then add a little sugar, a glass of port, and some pounded ice. Strain before drinking, leaving out the ice and the straining. This is exactly the same refresher which the friends of a criminal, who had served his term of incarceration in one of His Majesty's jails, were in the habit of providing for him, and when the cold Bathfields prison was a going concern, there was a small hostelry hard by, in which, on a Monday morning, the consumption of port wine, fruity, and eggs, shoppins every one, was considerable. This on the word of an ex-warder who subsequently became a stage door-keeper. One of the most unsatisfactory effects of good living is that the demon invoked overnight does not always assume the same shape in your waking hours. Many sufferers will feel a loathing for any sort of food or drink except cold water. "The capting," observed the soldier servant to a visitor, this is an old story, "ain't very well this morning, sir. He's just drunk his bath and gone to bed again." And on the other hand, I have known the overindulger absolutely ravenous for his breakfast. Brandy and soda, no, dear old chappie, as many eggs as they can poach in 5 minutes, a thick rasher of York ham, 2 muffins, and about 1.5 gallons of hot coffee. That's what I feel like. Medical men will be able to explain those symptoms in the roisterer, who had probably eaten and drunk quite as much overnight as the capting. For the roisterer with a shy appetite, there are few things more valuable than an anchovy toast. The concoction of this belongs to bedroom cookery, unless the sitting room adjoins the sleeping apartment, for the patient will probably be too faint of heart to wish to meet his fellow men and women downstairs so early. The mixture must be made over hot water. Nearly fill a slop basin with the boiling element and place a soup plate over it. In the plate melt a pat of butter the size of a walnut. Then, having beaten up a raw egg, stir it in. When thoroughly incorporated with the butter, add a dessertspoonful of essence of anchovies. Cayenne ad lib. Then let delicately browned crisp toast be brought, hot from the fire. Soak this in the mixture, and eat as quickly as you can. The above proportions must be increased if more than one patient clamors for anchovy toast, and this recipe is of no use for a dinner or luncheon toast. Remember that. After the meal is finished, turn in between the sheets again for an hour, then order a doctor or a surgeon major to be brought to the bedside. In another 20 minutes the patient will be ready for his tub, with the chill off if he be past 30, and has any wisdom or liver left within him. After dressing, if he live in London and there be any trace of brain rack remaining, let him take a brisk walk to his hairdresser's, having his boots cleaned en route. This is most important, whether they be clean or dirty, for the action of a pair of briskly directed brushes over the feet will often remove the most distressing of headaches. Arrived at the peruker's, let the patient direct him to rub eau de cologne or some other perfumed spirit into the o'ertaxed cranium, and to squirt assorted essences over the distorted countenance. A good hard brush and a dab of bay rum on the temples will complete the cure. The roisterer will then be ready to face his employer, or the maiden aunt from whom he may have expectations. If the flavor of the anchovy be disagreeable, let the patient try the following toast, which is similar to that used with wildfowl. Melt a pat of butter over hot water, stir in a dessert spoonful of Worcester sauce, the same quantity of orange juice, a pinch of cayenne, and about half a wineglassful of old port. Soak the toast in this mixture. The virtues of old port as a restorative cannot be too widely known. St. Mark's Pick-me-up. The following recipe was given to the writer by a member of an old Venetian family. 10 drops of Angostura in a liquor glass filled up with orange bitters, 1 wineglassful of old brandy, 1 ditto cold water, 1 liquor glassful of curacao, and the juice of half a lemon. Mix well together. I have not yet tried this, which reads rather acid. For an overtrained athlete, who may not take kindly to his rations, there is no better cure than the lean of an underdone chop, not blue inside, hot from the fire on a hot plate with a glass of port poured over. A hot pickle sandwich should be made of 2 thin slices of crisp toast, no butter, with chopped West Indian pickles in between. And for a deviled biscuit, select the plain cheese biscuit, heat in the oven, and then spread over it a paste composed of finely pounded lobster worked up with butter, made mustard, ground ginger, cayenne, salt, chili vinegar, and, if liked, a little curry powder. Reheat the biscuit for a minute or two, and then deal with it. Both the last named restoratives will be found valuable liver tonics, and to save future worry the patient had better calculate at the same time the amount of estate duty which will have to be paid out of his personalty, and secure a nice dry corner out of the draft for his place of sepulture. A working man's livener, and by working man the gentleman whose work consists principally in debating in taverns is intended, is usually a hair of the dog that bit him overnight, and in some instances where doubt may exist as to the particular tufter of the pack which found the working man out, the livener will be a miscellaneous one. For solid food this brand of laborer will usually select an uncooked red herring, which he will divide into swallow portions with his clasp knife, after borrowing the pepper caster from the tavern counter. And as new rum mixed with fourpenny ale occasionally enters into the overnight's program of the horny-handed one, he is frequently very thirsty indeed before the hour of noon. I have seen a journalist suck half a lemon, previously well besprinkled with cayenne, prior to commencing his matutinal scratch. But rum and milk form, I believe, the favourite livener throughout the district which lies between the Adelphi Theatre and St. Paul's Cathedral. And according to Dr. Edward Smith, the chief English authority on dietetics, rum and milk form the most powerful restorative known to science. With all due respect to Dr. Smith, I am prepared to back another restorative, commonly known as a small bottle, which means a pint of champagne. I have prescribed this many a time, and seldom known it fail. In case of partial failure, repeat the dose. A valuable if seldom employed restorative is made with Bovril as one of the ingredients. Make half a pint of beef tea in a tumbler with this extract. Put the tumbler in a refrigerator for an hour, then add a liquor glassful of old brandy with just a dust of cayenne. This is one of the very best pick-me-ups known to the faculty. A swizzle, for recuperative purposes, is made with the following ingredients: a wineglassful of Hollands, a liquor glassful of curacao, 3 drops of Angostura bitters, a little sugar, and half a small bottle of seltzer water. Churn up the mixture with a swizzle stick, which can be easily made with the assistance of a short length of cane, the ordinary school treat brand, a piece of cork, a piece of string, and a pocket knife. A very extraordinary pick-me-up is mentioned by Mr. F. C. Phillips in one of his novels, and consists of equal parts of brandy and chili vinegar in a large wine glass. Such a mixture would in all probability corrode sheet iron. I am afraid that writers of romance occasionally borrow a little from the imagination. The most effectual restorative for the total abstainer is unquestionably old brandy. It should be remembered that a rich, heavy dinner is not bound to digest within the human frame if washed down with tea or aerated beverages. In fact, from the personal appearances of many worthy teetotalers, I have known digestion cannot be their strong suit. Then many abstainers only abstain in public for the sake of example, and within the locked cupboard of the study lurks a certain black bottle which does not contain Kopp's ale. Therefore I repeat that the most effectual restorative for the total abstainer, whether as a direct change or as a hair of the dog, is brandy. Our ancestors cooled their coppers with small ale, and enjoyed a subsequent sluice at the pump in the yard. These methods are still pursued by stable helpers and such like. A good walk acts beneficially sometimes. Eat or drink nothing at all, but try and do 5 miles along the turnpike road within the hour. Many habitual roisterers hunt the next morning with heads opening and shutting alternately until the fox breaks covert, when misery of all sorts at once takes to itself wings. And I have heard a gallant warrior, whilst engaged in a polo match on York Knavesmire, protest that he could distinctly see 2 polo balls. But he was not in such bad case as the eminent jockey who declined to ride a horse in a hood and blinkers, because one of us must see, and I'm hanged if I can. It was the same jockey who, upon being remonstrated with for taking up his whip at the final bend when his horse was winning easily, replied, "Whip be blowed, it was my balance pole, I should have fell off without it." Straight talks. In the lowest depth there is a lower depth, which not only threatens to devour, but which will infallibly devour the too persistent roisterer. For such I labor not. The seer of visions, the would-be strangler of serpents, the baffled rat-hunter, and other victims to the overestimation of human capacity will get no assistance beyond infinite pity from the mind which guides this pen. The dog will return to his own vomit. The wilful abuser of the goods sent by a bountiful Providence is past praying for. But to others who are on the point of crossing the Rubicon of good discretion, I would urge that there will assuredly come a time when the pick-me-up will lose its virtue, and will fail to chase the sorrow from the brow, to minister to the diseased mind. Throughout this book I have endeavored to preach the doctrine of moderation and enjoyment. Meat and drink are, like fire, very good servants, but the most oppressive and exacting of slave-drivers. Therefore enjoy the sweets of life whilst ye can, but as civilized beings, as gentlemen, and not as swine. For here is a motto which applies to eating and drinking even more than to other privileges which we enjoy: "Wisely and slow they stumble who run fast." A resort to extremes is always to be deprecated, and many sensible men hold the total abstainer in contempt, unless he abstains simply and solely because a moderate use of beer and baccy makes him ill. And this man is indeed a rarity. The teetotaler is either a creature with no will power in his composition, a Pharisee who thanks Providence that he is not as other men, or a lunatic. There can be no special virtue in swearing off good food and good liquor, whether for the sake of example, or for the sake of ascending a special pinnacle, and posing to the world as the incarnation of perfection and holiness. In the parable, the publican was justified rather than the Pharisee, because the former had the more common sense, and knew that if he set up as immaculate and without guile, he was deceiving himself and nobody else. But here on earth, in the 19th century, the publican stands a very poor chance with the Pharisee, whether the last name assume the garb of social purity or vigilance, or the sombre raiment of policeman. This is not right. This is altogether wrong. The total abstainer, the rabid jackass who denies himself, or claims that he does so, the juice of the grape, and drinks the horrible flatulent concoctions known as temperance beverages, is just as great a sinner against common sense as that rabid jackass, the habitual glutton or drunkard, who in abusing the good things of life, the gifts which are given us to enjoy, is putting together a rod of rattlesnakes for his own back. There is nothing picturesque about drunkenness, and there is still less of manliness therein. There is plenty of excuse for the careless, happy-go-lucky, casual overestimator, who revels on festive occasions with his boon companions. 'Tis a poor heart that never rejoices, and wedding feasts, celebrations of famous victories, birthday parties, and Christmas festivities have been, and will continue to be, held by high and low from the earliest times. But there is no excuse, but only pity and disgust, for the sot who sits and soaks, or worse still, stands and soaks, in the tavern day after day, and carries the brandy bottle to bed with him. I have lived through 2/3 of the years allotted to man, and have never yet met the man who has done himself or anybody else any good by eating or drinking to excess. Nor is the man who has benefited himself or society through scorning and vilifying good cheer a familiar sight in our midst. Keep in the middle of the road is the rule to be observed. and there is no earthly reason why the man who may have applied hot and rebellious liquors to his blood as a youth should not enjoy that lusty winter of old age, frosty but kindly, provided those warm and warlike liquors have been applied in moderation. I will conclude this sermon with part of a verse of the poet Dryden's imitation of the 29th Ode of Horace, though its heathen carpe diem sentiments should be qualified by a special caution as to the possible ill effects of bidding too fierce a defiance to the reaction day. Happy the man, and happy he alone, he who can call today his own, he who, secure within, can say, tomorrow do thy worst. I've lived today. End of section 22. Recording by Philip Gould. End of Cakes and Ale by Edward Spencer.